They say medieval battles were all about swords, shields, and brute strength. But what most people don't realize is that some of the deadliest moments in medieval warfare didn't happen during open combat. They happened in complete silence. A step in the wrong place, a hand reaching for the wrong weapon, or a moment's hesitation could mean instant death. Hidden beneath the ground built into castle walls or waiting deep in the forest, medieval traps were carefully designed not just to kill, but to spread fear, slow down armies, and dismantle enemy forces without ever drawing a sword. And the scariest part? You usually didn't even see them until it was far too late. In this video, we're going to take a serious look at how these traps worked, who built them, and why they were so terrifyingly effective. Because behind every knight charging into battle, there was someone trying to make sure he never even got that far. Number 1. Invisible killers beneath your feet. In the harsh reality of medieval warfare, one of the deadliest and most unsettling traps required no complex engineering or expensive materials. The concealed pit, sometimes simple, sometimes refined, was designed to exploit one basic truth. Soldiers on the move don't watch their feet. These traps were dug out manually, often by laborers or low-ranking soldiers working under the cover of darkness, or hidden by the natural terrain. Once deep enough, the base of the pit would be lined with sharpened wooden stakes, angled upward to maximize damage. Some versions even used metal-tipped spikes, though that depended on resources and urgency. The real danger, however, wasn't the spikes themselves. It was how well the entire thing could be hidden in plain sight. Camouflage was everything. Builders would carefully cover the top of the pit with thin, flexible sticks or woven branches, then lay a layer of dirt, leaves, or hay to match the surrounding environment. From above, even at close range, the ground would appear completely undisturbed. In narrow forest paths where sunlight was filtered through the canopy and the terrain was uneven by nature, these traps became practically invisible. The same applied to dried fields after harvest or embankments, where retreating troops might regroup. Placement wasn't random. These traps were often located along predicted movement routes, such as escape paths or narrow flanks where defenders expected enemy soldiers to funnel through under pressure. The horror of these pits wasn't just in how they killed, but in how they destabilized entire formations. When the first soldier stepped into one, he would fall straight down, often impaled or fatally injured before he could scream. The man behind him, unable to stop due to the tight spacing and momentum of the formation, might trip and tumble in after him. Chaos spread quickly. The sound of armor crashing, men yelling in confusion, and the sudden halt in movement would send a ripple of disorder through the entire unit. In the tight structure of medieval infantry lines, losing rhythm meant losing control. Some of these pits were deliberately made unsanitary, filled with stagnant water, rotting remains, or animal waste to increase the chances of infection. Even if a soldier survived the fall, he might be left crippled or suffer a slow, agonizing death days later. And if his comrades tried to help him out, they became easy targets for archers or ambush parties waiting nearby. In practice, a single well-placed pit could neutralize several men, delay a charge, or break the cohesion of an advancing force. These traps weren't glamorous or honorable, but they were brutally effective and terrifyingly efficient. Number 2. Trapdoors, deadfalls, and engineered entrances. Medieval castles were not only centers of power and defense, but also complex structures filled with subtle dangers. While the massive stone walls, towers, and fortified gates were designed to repel large-scale attacks, many fortresses were also built with traps, hidden in plain sight, embedded directly into their architecture. These weren't last-minute additions. They were carefully planned features meant to deceive and eliminate intruders without open combat. The most unsettling part is that these traps didn't look like weapons at all. They looked like ordinary hallways, stairs, or doors, features every visitor or attacker would expect to find. One of the most deceptive designs was the collapsing floor mechanism. A corridor or chamber might appear stable and well-maintained, but under the surface, wooden panels were supported by a release system connected to weights or levers. As soon as someone stepped on a specific point, sometimes marked subtly or not at all, the support gave way. What followed was either a sudden fall onto a set of sharpened stakes hidden below, or a drop into a locked underground room, where the intruder could be captured or left to die. Some trapdoors led to dungeons not intended for holding prisoners, but for permanently removing enemies without leaving bodies behind. Once someone disappeared into these sections of the castle, there was rarely a way back up. Engineered staircases added another layer of danger. Certain stone steps could pivot or collapse inward when too much pressure was applied, especially near the upper levels. This feature was particularly effective during times of siege when attackers tried to storm the higher ground quickly. In some cases, defenders could activate the mechanism manually, reversing part of a staircase so that invaders were suddenly thrown backwards or slid into a shaft below. These weren't makeshift solutions, they were deliberate elements, often hidden so skillfully that even castle residents not involved in defense wouldn't recognize them. These mechanisms usually relied on simple physics, counterweights, pulleys, and gravity, but they were built with a level of precision that made them reliable and easy to reset. Guards stationed in key rooms would pull levers connected to iron bars or ropes that held these features in place. The timing had to be exact, especially at night when visibility was poor and attackers relied on torchlight. Shadows, flickering flames, and unfamiliar layouts made even solid floors seem uncertain. In those conditions, one wrong step could mean the end, without warning, without sound, and without any real chance to react. Number 3. Murder holes and death from above. When invading forces managed to breach the outer walls of a fortified stronghold, they often assumed the hardest part was over. But in reality, they were walking straight into a carefully calculated kill zone. Castle designers knew that the space between the outer and inner defenses was a critical choke point, and they used that narrow area to full advantage. Attackers were funneled into confined corridors or courtyards where movement was restricted and options for retreat were minimal. Above these spaces, built directly into the overhead structures, were vertical shafts known as murder holes. Simple in concept, but devastating in effect. These openings allowed defenders stationed on higher levels to attack from above with complete safety. The methods they used weren't random or improvised, they were brutal and deliberate. One of the most common tactics was pouring heated materials such as boiling water, sand, or even quicklime through the holes. Unlike metal weapons, these substances didn't need direct contact to be effective. Heated sand, for example, could slip through the smallest gaps in a helmet or armor, burning the skin beneath and causing unbearable pain without visible injury. Quicklime, when it came into contact with moisture like sweat or eyes, produced a chemical reaction that led to blinding and skin damage. These weren't just deterrents, they were meant to disable and disorient. In some situations, heavy stones or bricks were dropped through the holes to break skulls or shatter bones. When available, boiling pitch was used, a thick tar-like substance that stuck to skin and continued to burn long after contact. Unlike water or oil, it couldn't be wiped off easily, especially during the chaos of battle. Defenders didn't even need to aim precisely. In such tight quarters, it was enough to release the material from above and let gravity do the rest. And since the attackers were boxed in with walls on both sides and sometimes a gate behind them, there was almost no way to avoid the incoming assault. The psychological effect of murder holes was just as powerful as the physical damage they caused. An advancing force, already exhausted from climbing siege ladders or battering through gates, suddenly found themselves under attack from an enemy they couldn't see. Panic would set in quickly. Confusion spread, formations broke, and any momentum gained during the initial breach was lost. In many recorded sieges, attackers were forced to retreat from these inner kill zones before even laying eyes on the defenders. The murder holes weren't the most complex trap, but they were among the most efficient and deadly tools built into medieval fortress design. Number 4. The silent traps in the wild. Not every deadly encounter during medieval warfare took place at the walls of a castle or within a fortified city. In fact, a significant part of the danger existed far from any visible structure. Forests, narrow valleys, Rugged mountain paths and the winding roads that connected villages to larger towns were all potential killing grounds, filled with traps laid in advance to weaken or scatter enemy forces before they even reached their main objective. These areas, often covered by natural vegetation and surrounded by uneven terrain, offered perfect concealment for carefully planned ambushes, using traps that were silent, sudden, and devastating. Among the most feared were spring-loaded traps that made use of the natural strength of young trees. A common design involved bending a sapling or flexible tree trunk toward the ground, attaching a sharpened stake or heavy object to its upper end, and securing it with a thin cord connected to a tripwire. When someone unknowingly walked across the wire, the tension was released and the tree snapped back into its upright position with enormous speed, driving the attached weapon directly into the chest, neck, or face of the person who triggered it. These traps were easy to build using materials from the environment, required no advanced metalwork, and could be placed in almost complete silence by small teams during night operations. Other designs borrowed ideas from animal hunting. Swinging spiked balls, large logs suspended horizontally, or even nets fitted with hooks could be triggered from the side of a trail. These traps were rarely intended to wipe out entire units. Instead, they were used to disrupt movement, injure key figures like officers or scouts, and create a sense of constant unease within enemy ranks. Soldiers who believed the area had already been cleared would suddenly be reminded that every step might be their last. That psychological effect often slowed down entire columns, especially when marching at night or through unfamiliar terrain. Night travel, while often necessary to avoid detection, made these traps even more effective. Under low light, detecting a nearly invisible cord stretched across a path became almost impossible, especially when the ground was uneven or covered in fallen leaves. A single trigger could lead to confusion and panic, particularly if the trapped soldier was at the front of the formation. Without a clear line of sight or knowledge of the terrain, the rest of the unit might hesitate, halt completely, or begin to move out of formation, exposing themselves to follow-up attacks. These silent traps, placed in the wild, far from any fortified walls, became an essential part of guerrilla tactics and small-scale defense, proving that the battlefield extended far beyond what most soldiers expected. Number 5. Moat traps and underwater torture. Moats surrounding medieval castles were far more than simple obstacles filled with water. While they appeared to be basic defensive features meant to slow down approaching forces or prevent siege equipment from reaching the walls, many were in fact complex death traps designed to injure, disorient, or kill anyone who attempted to cross them. These moats often hid far more than the surface revealed, and what waited below could easily turn an attempted assault into a disaster before attackers ever reached the gates. One of the most common and deadly enhancements to a moat was the installation of sharpened wooden stakes driven into the bottom at an angle. These were carefully spaced and hidden just beneath the surface of the water, positioned so that anyone attempting to swim across or wade through would be impaled by the points. The water's depth was often just enough to hide the tips from view while still allowing them to cause maximum injury to the lower body and torso. In many cases, the stakes were arranged irregularly to make it impossible to find a safe path through. Even those who wore armor were vulnerable. Metal plates didn't protect from injury when legs were exposed in water or when movement was slowed. Some defenders went further and added underwater caltrops, small metal devices with sharp spikes designed to always have one point facing upward. Originally used on dry land to stop horses and infantry, these were equally effective underwater. Soldiers trying to feel their way across the moat would step down onto one of these and immediately suffer puncture wounds through boots or bare skin. Pain, shock, and blood loss made further movement nearly impossible, and in the chaos of battle, wounded men often drowned before anyone could reach them. In certain fortifications, rotating spiked mechanisms were installed underwater, and powered by the flow of water itself or by hidden gear systems controlled from within the walls. These spinning weapons caused deep lacerations and created unpredictable movement in the water, making it harder to judge where it was safe to step. Some castles even had the ability to release scalding liquids or waste into the moat through built-in sluices. Defenders could flood the water with hot oil, boiling water, or sewage during an assault, using heat and infection as weapons. And even if an attacker managed to get across, that wasn't the end. False footholds, trapdoors, and staircases designed to collapse under weight were often waiting just beyond the water, ensuring that anyone who survived the moat was already too injured or disoriented to pose a real threat. Number 6. Traps used. During field campaigns, warfare during the medieval period wasn't limited to castle sieges and fixed fortifications. Much of the conflict took place in the open, across miles of roads, fields, forests, and river crossings. Armies on the move were constantly vulnerable, especially in hostile territory where the enemy had time to prepare the landscape to their advantage. Traps used during field campaigns were not only effective at inflicting physical damage, but were also aimed at slowing progress, spreading fear, and throwing entire marching columns into confusion. Unlike fixed defenses, these traps were mobile, adaptable, and could be placed quickly by small groups acting ahead of or behind retreating forces. One common strategy was to leave behind false supplies during a retreat. Barrels, crates, and even entire wagons might appear abandoned and ripe for looting, but inside they held explosives, weighted mechanisms, or even contaminated food. Opening one might trigger a sudden burst of shrapnel from a hidden container, or worse, spread illness among troops who unknowingly consumed spoiled or poisoned rations. These tactics were especially effective when enemy forces were tired, hungry, and less cautious after chasing an opponent for days. Other traps targeted specific terrain features that troops were likely to use. Shallow river crossings and narrow fords were ideal spots to bury sharpened stakes just under the mud, where cavalry and supply carts would naturally pass. These traps were simple in design but highly effective. Horses could be crippled, wheels shattered, and movement brought to a halt within minutes. Because these areas were natural choke points, a single incident could stall an entire army, giving defenders precious time to regroup or reposition. Deception also played a key role. Fake campfires, visible from higher ground or well-used trails, were sometimes used to lure scouts or small squads into preset kill zones. These zones were rigged with tripwires connected to crossbows or simple dart launchers, hidden behind tree trunks or in tall grass. The goal wasn't to eliminate a whole unit, but to break their confidence, force hesitation, and create a constant atmosphere of tension. Soldiers began second-guessing each step, scanning every branch and bush for signs of a trap. In response, experienced commanders started assigning specific troops to scan ahead for signs of tampering in the environment. These men were trained to notice unnatural soil patterns, strange plant placement, or the sudden absence of animal movement, subtle details that might suggest human interference. Still, even well-trained eyes could miss a carefully hidden mechanism, and the unpredictability of such traps made long marches mentally exhausting. Every snapped twig or shifting shadow could trigger panic, making these traps not just tools of delay, but a constant source of psychological warfare that weighed heavily on morale over time. Number 7. Weapon traps and tricked equipment. In the chaos of medieval warfare, especially during prolonged sieges or disorganized retreats, it was not uncommon for the battlefield to be littered with abandoned gear. Swords stuck in the mud, shields leaning against tree stumps, or pieces of armor scattered near burned-out tents. To the untrained eye, these items appeared to be the spoils of war or simply the remnants of a defeated enemy, but in many cases they were anything but harmless. Weapon traps and rigged equipment became a subtle but deadly tactic used to strike at enemies through deception rather than direct combat. One of the most dangerous forms of this tactic involved weapons treated with toxic substances. Swords, daggers, or axe handles were sometimes coated with contact poisons, derived from plants like belladonna or wolfsbane. A soldier picking up such a weapon would unknowingly absorb the poison through small cuts on his hands or exposed skin. Symptoms wouldn't appear immediately, which added to the trap's effectiveness. Hours after arming themselves with what they thought was a lucky find, these soldiers would begin to experience dizziness, blurred vision, muscle weakness, and eventually paralysis or death. In the middle of a military campaign, one man falling ill could go unnoticed, but several suffering the same fate would sow confusion and fear across entire units. Hidden mechanisms added another layer of danger. Some swords and maces had compartments inside the hilt that, when gripped too tightly or pulled in a certain way, would activate a small internal spring, releasing a sharpened spike or dart aimed at the user's hand or wrist. The injury alone might not be fatal, but it could easily disable a fighter, or cause them to drop the weapon in the middle of a fight. The shock of being wounded by your own blade had a psychological impact just as damaging as the physical harm. Even armor wasn't spared. Certain pieces of chainmail or plate armor were altered from the inside, with hooked barbs or thin spikes embedded into the lining. To someone desperate for protection, the trap wouldn't become clear until after they had put it on. Once worn, every movement caused the barbs to dig deeper, tearing into muscle and skin. Removing the armor often required assistance and came at the cost of additional injury. Shields, too, could be modified by attaching pouches of fine powder or flammable material behind a fragile covering, so that a strong blow would ignite an instant flash or explosion, stunning or burning the person holding it. These tactics were grim and went far beyond the rules of chivalry or honor. But in the brutal reality of siege warfare, survival often depended on outsmarting the enemy, even if it meant turning their curiosity or desperation against them. The mere possibility that a weapon or piece of gear might be trapped forced soldiers to hesitate, sometimes at the worst possible moment. And in battle, that hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Number 8. The engineers behind the traps. In the violent structure of medieval warfare, the attention often went to the knights in polished armor, the generals commanding armies, or the siege weapons crashing into walls. But behind many victories in well-defended fortresses stood a quieter, far less visible figure. These were the minds who rarely stepped onto the battlefield, but shaped its outcome long before the first sword was drawn. Trap makers, engineers, blacksmiths, carpenters, hunters, and in some cases even scholars and alchemists, were the hidden force that turned terrain, architecture, and psychology into weapons of war. Their work wasn't fast or glorious, but it was deliberate, effective, and devastating. These individuals studied not just weapons and materials, but also human behavior. They knew how soldiers moved, where commanders liked to set up camp, how patrols were scheduled, and which routes invading forces typically favored when approaching a stronghold. Every repeated pattern was an opportunity. If enemy troops were known to take the same path through a forest, or use a certain side road to approach a river crossing, that knowledge could be turned into a trap that would cost lives before the first clash of swords. What made trap makers dangerous wasn't just their technical ability, it was their ability to think ahead, to imagine how the enemy would behave, and to use that insight to lay the foundation for their destruction. Inside castles, they worked closely with architects to embed traps into the very walls and floors of the structure. A staircase might appear ordinary, but one false step could activate a concealed mechanism. A hallway might lead nowhere, or worse, into a dead end, filled with boiling sand or collapsing beams. Some engineers even designed sound traps, hallways where the acoustics were altered to create confusing echoes, disorienting intruders in the dark. Other designs played with lighting, using slits in walls or mirrors to reflect torchlight in misleading ways. These weren't just physical obstacles, they were meant to disrupt focus, stir panic, and fracture the enemy's confidence before any blade was drawn. Not all trap makers worked alone. In more advanced strongholds, they collaborated with those who specialized in deception: illusionists, performers, or even artists. Together, they created rooms where the walls appeared closer than they were, doorways led to spinning panels, and furniture concealed deadly devices. Their aim was not simply to defend a territory, but to turn the environment itself into a living trap. A well-designed castle didn't just keep invaders out, it consumed them from within. Trap makers didn't fight with swords, but they wielded knowledge like a blade. They were paid well, sometimes better than soldiers, because lords and rulers understood the value of one clever mind against 100 men. In the unforgiving world of medieval combat, where every advantage counted, these engineers were the silent architects of fear, leaving no warning, no second chances, only the cruel reminder that war wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, precise, and waiting just beneath your feet.